The last thing that you'd ever wish to happen to you is getting lost in the middle of nowhere. And in today's episode, I have some scary stories about the same. But before we begin, make sure you have subscribed to Mr. Scare, because our horror community keeps growing regularly, and I'd love it if you too become a part of it. And now, let's start reading. I am an airline pilot, and here's my middle of nowhere story. I've flown to some odd destinations, but one of the creepiest was Ciudad Juarez. If you don't know about this place, it is notorious for drug mafia, human trafficking, and all other illegal stuff. There is violence too. Me and two flight attendants were bored on an El Paso layover, so we decided to get drinks at around 11 p.m. We drank until the bars closed at 2, and on the way out we asked the bartender if anything else was still open.
Not unless you want to go to Ciudad Juarez,
he joked. I looked at the flight attendants. We shrugged, nodded, and said,
"Okay."
He was shocked that we took him seriously. We walked the short distance back to the hotel, grabbed our passports, and set out for Mexico. Before we left, I asked the flight attendants, who were both women, if they were sure they were okay with this.
"Yeah, sure, as long as you're coming too."
Liquid's courage had officially overruled any fears of being kidnapped or beheaded, and off we went to the place. So we walked 20 minutes south to the border. El Paso was completely dead quiet aside from a few homeless people. Some of them stumbling around and are clearly under the influence of drugs. But none of them bothered us. We reached the Mexican border, and the guards took an extra second to look at the three crazy gringos before waving us through. It was close to 3 a.m. at this point, and we were three 20-somethings wandering around the streets of Ciudad Juarez at night. I'm not sure how much you know about CJ, but it isn't exactly safe at night, especially for non-locals. The streets were pretty empty, and not a single bar was open, but everyone we passed stopped mid-conversation and stared at us as we walked by. The flight attendants were getting nervous and were walking so close to me that we were brushing up against each other. After determining that everything within a realistic distance of the border was closed, we turned around to head back to the US. We'd probably been in Ciudad Juarez for around an hour and somehow managed to navigate down the dark and deserted streets onto the same strip that we entered on. By this point, we were close enough to the border that there were a few street lights that were still on. All of a sudden, two locals stumbled out from the dark sidewalks into the street, which we were walking down the middle of. As they came into the light, all three of us jumped at what we saw. A man and a woman, both with scarred faces, hunched backs, excessive sweat, ripped clothing, and missing teeth, were grinning as they approached us. The man was half speaking Spanish and half laughing. The startle factor of their approach combined with their appearance stands out as one of the biggest jump scares in my life. After realizing they weren't trying to kill us yet, I figured screw it, we'd come this far, why not throw a Hail Mary? To my own disbelief, I actually tried to communicate with the man and asked if he knew of any bars that were open. By this point, the flight attendants were so terrified that each one had latched themselves onto one of my arms. In any situation other than the one we were currently in, I'd have looked pretty cool. The man simply smiled, pointed behind him, and said that it was over there. There was a motel with all the lights turned off, except for a steady red light on the front balcony, and a light flickering from inside a room on the second floor. One of the flight attendants turned and said into my ear,
"No. Hell no. We need to leave now."
I thanked the man and woman for their time, and we hightailed it to the US border. They gave us a thorough questioning, and rightfully so, as one man and two women crossing into the US at around 4 a.m. reeks of human trafficking. Weirdly, the number of people huddled on the streets of El Paso had doubled, and we speed-walked back to our hotel. That layover definitely takes the cake for the creepiest thing to happen in the middle of nowhere. Apart from this, while being in the air, probably the creepiest thing I've ever heard was the distress call of a small general aviation aircraft going down. This was around 2014 in the Pacific Northwest. He had just blown a cylinder head, and oil was shooting out all over his windshield. You could hear the panic in his voice as he radioed out that he couldn't see and was trying to report his position to a few airliners so that they could relay it to the air traffic control. I checked the news that night, and he actually died in the crash. It was a pretty eerie feeling that we heard the last words of a pilot fighting for his life while we were just cruising along above the clouds at 35,000 feet, completely powerless to do anything other than reach out to him over the radio. I was driving on a cross-country road trip through the middle of nowhere somewhere in Kansas when I had one of my tires blow out. I pulled over and went to call the American Automobile Association, but I had no service on my phone. So I got out and started the process of trying to change the tire by myself. After a very short while, a cop pulled up and asked if I needed help. I said yes, thank you, officer, and he said,
"'Cause you're in luck. I just so happen to know the best tow truck driver. He could take you into town, and you could get all fixed up without any problem."
The mosquitoes were eating me alive, and frankly, I only had a donut-style replacement tire and no clue how to properly change it. So I said yes, please, and the officer gave the tow truck a call. After another short while, the tow truck arrived and the officer left. The driver asked,
"Where am I towing you to?"
So I was like, I'm not sure. To town, I guess. Somewhere where I can get my tire fixed. He said,
"Well, you're in luck, 'cause I know the guy at the only place that's open right now who can fix that for you."
I said okay, and he towed us to the auto repair place. This was basically a ghost town, if you could even call it a town. The tow truck driver and the repair guy sat around and bullshitted for a couple of hours while my tire was being fixed. Just bear in mind that there was nobody else there but me and my passengers. There was nobody else anywhere within sight. The town was literally empty except for the gas station connected to the repair place. Finally, they came out and said I was all set and gave me both my bills. One for the repair and one for the tow. $1,200 in total. For one tire and a 5-mile tow. For a 1991 Grand Am that wasn't even worth that much. I was furious but had no options, so I gave him my credit card and he was like,
"Sorry guy, we're a cash-only kind of town."
I was like, okay then, well I don't have any cash on me, so how are we going to settle this up then? And he was like,
"Well, you're in luck, because there's an ATM next door at the gas station my buddy owns."
So I went to the gas station and took out the maximum I could on 3 on 4 different cards, each with a $20 withdrawal fee. I looked behind the counter, and in addition to the gas station attendant, there stood the cop, the tow truck driver, and the repair guy all munching on Doritos and having a good laugh. I'm pretty sure I got hosed, and potentially maybe even sabotaged. Looking back, that cop sure arrived really quickly, and my other 3 tires were all still relatively new. I had to cut my trip short and invest in cortisone cream for the million mosquito bites. Most importantly, I am just glad that I made it out alive. Because if I had taken any hasty decisions, they might have looted me and even killed me in that ghost town. I was running through California one night and started to get sleepy. I pulled out on the side of the road and decided to take a nap. The load I was picking up had got rescheduled, and so I decided to just hang out where I was, out until it was closer to my normal drive time, which was at night. I was starting to learn how to do astrophotography, and where I was parked was a pretty decent spot. Nice and dark, with not a lot of traffic at night. And so I decided I would try and practice some shots. I climbed up onto the top of my trailer, just above my reefer unit on the edge, and sat there learning how to do aperture settings and all that. All of a sudden, I hear a noise coming from the bush directly below me. I felt pretty safe in the knowledge that no animal was climbing up to the 13 feet height of a trailer that I was on. I picked up my flashlight and started looking around the ground for the sound. But to my surprise, I found absolutely nothing. So I rode it off to the wind and went back to figuring out the camera settings. About 2 minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was a little further down my trailer, so I shined my flashlight out there again. Yet again, I could see nothing. It was just the bush. By this time, I was starting to get concerned about what I was hearing. The sound I was hearing didn't sound like a small animal, but more like someone moving around below me. The passenger door to my truck was locked, but I left the driver's door unlocked, and since I was sitting close to that side of the trailer, I could see if anyone was going to approach it. I turn my light off and go back to what I was doing. About 5 minutes later, I hear someone say,
"Hey!"
My heart jumped into my throat. I grab my light, stand up on the trailer, and start frantically looking around the edge of the truck. Not a goddamn thing. Nothing fishy or out of the ordinary was visible. It was just the same as it was before when I searched around with my light. I remained as quiet as possible, still looking around the bush with my light. Whoever was out there, I didn't want them to hear how panicked I was. It felt like time was standing still in this instance, because it was pitch black out there, and no car or truck has passed me in over an hour. Roughly a minute had gone by, and I heard my trailer door handle unlock and release. Now thankfully I was empty, so there was no load for anyone to steal. But they didn't open the door. Whoever it was, unlocked the trailer door and stopped, as if to draw me to the back of the trailer. I had no time to think about what I was going to do. I snapped out of my panic freeze and jumped down to the catwalk. The catwalk is the walkway on the back of the cab of the truck. So I jumped down there and hit the ground as fast as possible. I jumped in the truck and locked the door, fired up the truck, and took off as fast as I could. I drove for about 5 minutes, rarely taking my eyes off my side mirror to see if I was being followed. I felt like it was safe enough for me to pull off and close the door of the trailer. At this point, I'm trembling because of the pure adrenaline running through me. I stopped that truck as fast as I could, bolted to the back, and shut the trailer door and locked it. Got back in the truck and left that area as fast as I could. To this day, I still don't know what the hell this person was doing or what their endgame was. I never stopped on that spot again after that. I even gave up trying to learn astrophotography too. I was a taxi driver in Georgia, and one time I got a call about an $80 round trip to the outskirts of town. The GPS said 30 minutes, but for some reason, it ended up taking me an hour and a half. It was the last call of the day, and I had just started a week ago. And I wanted to make an impression, so I took the call and picked up 3 ladies who were all dressed like hookers to someone's house where we picked up 3 more apparent hookers, and the whole way they were quiet as hell. It made me nervous. Anyway, we were on our way to the location when I started running out of gasoline. I put in the GPS to a gas station 3 times, but unfortunately, all of them were closed. The closer we got to the location, the less and less there were streetlights and gas stations and stores, and more dirt roads and endless forest. Eventually, I had to ask them where the heck we were going. And they said,
"Just go, and we'll pay you."
And I thought, as far as we've been, and as far as we're going, you better pay me, goddammit. We went down a dirt road on a mountain for what seemed like 20 minutes, and found one lone trailer in the middle of a farm surrounded by forest, where my signal didn't even catch. The ladies all went inside to fetch me the cash, and I hung out in my van for like 30 minutes as they all came in and came out and argued about who's gonna pay me. Eventually, one butch-looking scary-ass lady walked up and handed me my $180. All she said was,
"Now get the hell out of here."
And I said, "Yes, miss." I wasn't about to argue with whatever the heck was going on, so I left. Now getting back was a hard time. I took so many wrong turns, I ended up in Dahlonega. But I found a gas station just as my car decided to die. I had to push it into the racetrack and was able to find an old-ass dusty map and charge my phone to figure out where the heck I needed to go to get out of this podunk town. I quit the taxi the next week. Too many creepy weirdos in this business. I am a rural sheriff's deputy in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. We had 2 of us who patrolled almost 500 miles of road, and it wasn't uncommon for weird shit to happen. These are the ones that I still can't explain. On patrol, one night around 2 a.m., going down a pitch-black country road on a no-moon night. I'm traveling about 60 miles an hour, and I come to a set of small rolling hills. I go down the first hill, back up, back down, and as I get to the bottom, there is a person right in front of my car. It looked like an old woman in a white gown. I know it sounds like every scary movie, but this is what happened, and I knew I was going to hit her. I locked up the brakes, and she was at the dead center of my cruiser about 10 to 15 feet out. I braced for impact, and I guess I locked up the brakes so hard that the car fishtailed at the last minute. She passed right beside my door and window. I could have reached out and grabbed her. Of course, it all happened so fast that it was a blur, and I have no features of the person that I could remember. I stop and thank God that I didn't kill some poor old woman who wandered out of her house. And as you guessed it, she was gone. And to top it off, this was right next to an old church and cemetery. I looked and yelled, but never saw the woman again. Eventually, I got creeped out and just left. I have no idea what the hell happened. There are no houses within miles of this church and cemetery. There is another story to share. This probably happened a few years later or before this incident. I can't remember at this point since it was decades ago. This happened in the same part of the county and not that far away. In fact, it was actually just a few miles down that same exact road. Similar time of the night, I was on patrol. And I am coming up to a giant straight stretch of the road that contained a four-way intersection. I see headlights approaching me, and I slow down to come to a stop at the intersection. I realize after a few seconds that the headlights are just sitting in the roadway about 100 yards away. Strange, but not the weirdest thing. I mean, it could be a drunk dude at the wheel who has passed out while driving. I start driving up to see what's happening, and the headlights go out. So I stop for a second and wonder what the hell is happening. The lights come back on. I sit there for a second, and both lights elevate about 10 feet off the ground, and then come together to form a single, bright light. At this point, I'm starting to feel my skin crawl. The light immediately goes out. I turn all of my lights on, and go down the road to try to figure out what it is that I just saw. I came across nothing. No cars, farming equipment, nothing. There's no way that whatever was on that road could have gotten around me or turned around and left without me seeing them. To this day, I have no clue what those lights were. And I am not the only one who has experienced and come across such phantom lights. Some urban legends state that those are aliens or secret government machines. As long as they aren't harming anyone, I don't care. My father always tells me the story of when he was backpacking alone with his dog on the Pacific Crest Trail in Northern California in the late 70s. My dad had parked his car on the side of a highway, and he and his dog were about 7 miles down the trail. It was going to be late in the afternoon, so he was hoping to find a place to spend the night. Suddenly his dog starts to make a low growl, and the hair on her back stands up. My dad was thinking there was possibly a bear or something nearby, as his dog was a very experienced backpack dog and was not easily rattled by things. He looks around and doesn't see anything. He notices that Maka is basically pointing out a spot on the trail with her nose a little bit ahead of them. He decides to walk up and see what she's looking at. And there he finds a massive footprint. To hear him describe it, this footprint was larger than anything a human can make, extremely deep, and had claw punctures. He said he stood and stared at it in disbelief for at least 5 minutes, because he didn't understand how this could possibly be on the trail. He thought perhaps it was a hoax or folks messing around, but he hadn't seen a soul, and he was in the middle of nowhere. Who would come out to the middle of the trail, where there are hardly any hikers, and then make a hoax footprint of some sort? And why was the dog so upset? He said he couldn't explain it, but he basically had this feeling of terror and turned around on the trail right then. He didn't know if it was his mind playing tricks on him, but he swore he heard sounds in the trees nearby that sounded like a large animal as he booked it out. His dog remained completely alarmed the whole hike back, whimpering and pacing, which was completely out of character. He said he basically ran 7 miles back down the trail as fast as he could go with his pack on and tore out of there in his car. To this day, he still claims it was one of the freakiest things he's ever experienced. My high school had a bunch of woods behind it. I lived in a rural part of Ohio, so there were cornfields and forest abundantly spread. It was also quite common for the cross-country runners to take their runs through some parts of the woods during practice sessions. I knew this because my ex-girlfriend was part of the cross-country team, and she would take runs through the woods quite frequently. At one point she told me that if you take an hour or two to run through the woods, there was an abandoned playground somewhere right in the middle. It made no sense to be built there. There were no houses nearby, or even any schools. And it was not really in a clearing where the playground was built. It was as if it was just built into the woods. I mean, it seemed like someone just stuck the equipment wherever it fit and converted that confined space into a playground. She also told me stories of how the runners would avoid that area and go around it in a long, wide circle if they got any hints that they were getting close to it. In fact, they would get to know it maybe like from half a mile away itself. And before you wonder as to how the runners would get to know if they were getting closer, let me explain. Because even I had the same doubt. I mean, if the runners saw the playground, they would turn and that would make sense. But how would they know that they were getting closer without actually getting within the viewing range? So my ex-girlfriend claimed that as you got closer to the grounds, you would start to hear footsteps behind you. And this was maybe like half a mile away itself. And that sound of footsteps would get faster as you approached the playground. The closer you got to the ground, it would get faster, and the other way round. So that way, it was possible to change the direction of the run so as to avoid the playground completely. Now, me being a high schooler and dumb, I grabbed my friend and told him that we should go to this place to see what was up. And we did. It took a gigantic amount of time to walk up there. And it really was an hour or so before we got there. But when we got there, we didn't hear any footsteps or any sort of movement around us at all. So we started to think if it was all a rumor started by the runners. Eventually, we got there and now we were literally at the playground. The only equipment there was a 2-swing set and one of those merry-go-round things where bullies strap nerds to in movies and spin them around for fun. Since we had walked all the way there, we were tired. And our excitement of finding something supernatural had ended in disappointment. So we decided to take a load off and hop on the swings for some harmless fun, just for a few minutes. So we got on the swings and went about our business. Everything was cool for about 2 minutes. And at that point, we were swinging at close to the maximum peak of our swing's height. As my friend swings backward and is coming back in his downswoop to go forward at full speed, he had no clue what was going to happen. While in the pendulum motion, he falls ahead and hits the ground, while the swing normally just sits in an idle position. He wasn't pushed ahead, but his swing had just completely halted. It was like the swing was grabbed by someone from behind saying, "All right, time's up." It had just halted mid-motion. So he was on the floor recovering from the sudden shock from the fall, while mine continued to swing. But I saw that and jumped the hell off my swing. My friend and I bolted out of there, shitting our pants. As we ran away, we started to hear those footsteps on either side of us. They were very fast at first and felt like they would catch up with us, but then they diminished once we got far enough away. We never went back. I did not even bring up the topic of that playground again. Now let's hop on to story number 2. But before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. In mid-2018, my girlfriend and I took a 3-week-long road trip and camped in the backwoods or hiked the whole time. Oh, by the way, I am a girl too. So it was just the 2 of us girls hanging out. We got to one free campsite in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in New Mexico. We were the only people there, and that was not so unusual. So we just took the first spot that we found good enough to set up our camp and started unpacking our stuff. As we made dinner, a couple pulled into the camping grounds, drove past us, and headed to the back of the campgrounds. It was a vast area, so we had no idea as to how far back it went. About 15 to 20 minutes later, they came back and flagged me down. The lady asked me if we had been back there. I just shook my head as a no. The girl's next line shocked me. She said that it was like a massacre back there. I asked her what did she mean by whatever she just said. She claimed that there were bones everywhere. Her face was reeking of anxiety. She asked if they could camp next to us, and we obliged. Now we were more than happy to have neighbors. It just feels safer in a larger group, especially when you're in the middle of nowhere. They stay for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, look around, then get back in their car and leave the campsite. My friend and I wondered as to what was all of that about. Like just a few minutes ago, they wanted to camp next to us. And now they left the site without saying anything. I explained to my friend what the girl had said, and at that moment, we looked down and noticed a huge femur bone under our feet. It was possibly a buffalo. Well, us being a little cryptic enthusiast, we decide to go check out what they were talking about. We get about 150 yards back through the windy camp, and there it was. There were full-blown animal carcasses everywhere. Some were scattered, some still whole, one pile of what looked like fox fur, and another deer body that was still in a trash bag. We had a theory of our own that kinda explained the situation. Our theory is that was where they dumped all the roadkill which they scraped up off the highway. But we didn't figure this out until a couple of days later. Nonetheless, if there were that many bodies lying around there, for whatever reason, then other predatory animals must be aware that they're here too. And we didn't want to be around whenever they come by for dinner. We decided to pack up and find a different camp for the night. So we drive for about an hour or so, still in the middle of nowhere, and haven't seen a single car this entire time. There were no houses, just old country roads and pastures. Mind you, the sun was starting to set. The road turned to dirt for a bit, and we crossed a cattle guard and saw the national park signboard. It was a national park and it was free, so it couldn't be too bad. My friend thought that the signboard looked a little sketchy, but we were ready to relax and get some well-deserved rest after an arduous day spent driving. So I hit the left turn and started up the hill to the national park. Looking at the map, it looked like it was only about 4 miles from the map. We started going up this road and drove around a few curves. We noticed that the brush on the side gradually starts getting thicker and thicker, and the road starts getting rough. Now, to put this in perspective, we're in my fairly new car, and it had a manual transmission. The ground clearance of my car was low, such that it was less than a foot from the ground. About a quarter mile in, and we high center on a huge rock. Okay, as long as that won't get any worse ahead, I thought that we could manage. Also, there was no possible way to turn around or back out anyway, so we decided to keep going. But of course, it got worse than that. Every rock and trench, we heard the car just scrape and stutter and stall. I'm clenching the wheel, and she's clenching the handle. All the bush on the sides of us is now dead and eerie looking, and the sun has almost gone behind us. 40 terrifying minutes later, we finally make it to the top flat of this hill, which was supposed to be a campsite. It is about a 10 square foot clearing in the dead bush, and in front of us, a cliff. We were still freaked out about the dead animals, and now we felt like we were in the plot of some low-budget horror film, literally trapped on top of this hill. It was dark and neither of us even wanted to get out of the car. We decided that we cannot camp there in our right minds. Even from this cliff top, we couldn't see a single house or even a car light. It might be a figment of our imagination, but we could hear some movement around us. And it felt like it was getting closer. We make a 10-point turn between the bush and boulders and the cliff, manage to get back on the path, and very slowly and carefully scrape our car all the way back down that damned hill. We in the car miraculously survived, and we had another 3 hours back to the closest town and slept in the Walmart parking lot. A couple of years ago, my friend and I went to explore a nearby cave. It wasn't an ordinary cave. It was a limestone cave where I had been before too, but never gone very deep inside to explore it. I had heard from other explorers that there was a waterfall inside the cave that eventually leads to an expansive area beyond. So my friend and I set out to try and find the path. Since we've never been on this route, we took turns going forward and checking back so as to avoid passing points of no return without one of us being above with a rope to toss down. After the familiar route was behind us, we found a tight climb down. The squeeze was like going from the front seat to the back seat, that too in a compact sedan that was vertical. Next, we found a tunnel that was wide but short. We took off our packs and dragged them behind our feet while we crawled for maybe 15 to 20 meters. It was getting a little claustrophobic, but we knew what we were getting into. We came to a small opening about the size of a small bathroom. In this little space, we could at least stand up, and so it was a bit of a relief to us. The path forward was a small square tunnel, the same height as the previous route, but maybe 2 to 3 meters wide. We jokingly called it the Coffin Crawl. This route required us to go one behind the other and led to a 90-degree turn. At the turn, I could see the path continued way past the range of my headlamp, but mostly all seemed level and safe. At this point, slowly it became apparent the path was getting more narrow ever so slightly. If we wanted to turn back, we would have had to crawl backward single file. I could not speculate how far we crawled, but it seemed like an extremely long way until I could see a small opening up ahead, maybe the size of a cramped coat closet, but 2/3 the height. At this point, that space was looking pretty comforting because it would mean we could at least turn around if we decided to go back. Right before the oncoming closet-sized space was the tightest squeeze I've ever tried in a cave. I had to place one arm ahead and drag the other to get my shoulders to fit diagonally. As my light illuminated the closet space, I could see a single stalagmite in the center and some bats resting on its walls and on the sloped ceiling. Small mouse-eared bats were uncommon, but not a shocking sight. But our voices disturbed them and they decided to exit. And their only exit was past our prone one-by-one bodies. Their fluttering should have been non-threatening, but in combination with the inability to move, it became very unsettling. It took a lot of mental control to avoid panicking from the lack of space, the apparent lack of air, and the bats. After the bats had passed and I had caught my breath and sanity, we entered the small opening. Upon the single stalagmite was a small note, the torn corner of a piece of notebook paper. The note had text written on it in blue pen. It read, "Nothing here." We had not found the path we sought, and instead found nothing. We turned back and finally made it back alive and in one piece. So being a little kid of around 10 to 12 years, I had my own creepy middle-of-nowhere story. We had these woods around our home. The woods were so vast that I never ever came close to finding the edge of it. I would wake up early in the morning when there was no school, and my friend Mark and I would spend the whole day out, hanging around those woods. We would pack sandwiches and sodas, and just go out exploring. This being the 80s and Mark and I being smart enough kids, my parents had no problem with this, and enjoyed taking us to the Army surplus store to buy stuff like MREs and survival knives, and camping gear. It was pretty regular that we would be allowed to stay out overnight too, if my dad was there to help us set up camp close to the property. So not on an overnight, but out and about one day, we come across a treehouse in a part of the woods where we had never been before. It would have been probably about an hour and a half long trek from the edge of the neighborhood. Maybe 2 miles or 3 miles, and the area was hilly and rocky. This treehouse was probably 25 to 35 feet off the ground, but it looked solid. We were so stoked to find our new castle and climb it to claim it. We hightail it back home to get some rope, and my pops take us down to the surplus store, and over dinner, Mark and I couldn't keep calm about it. The next day comes, and we hike out at almost dawn. We got a backpack full of rope and sandwiches. We had latched our knives on our hips, and we carried our water bottles to last there as long as possible. We make it out there and start attaching rungs made from big sticks onto one end of the rope. It took us a good few hours, but we get one side finished. We toss the rope over the branch, because that was where the little deck and the door were. We finally climbed up and were sitting on the deck looking at the scenic view from the top. And then we played 3 turns of rock, paper, scissors to decide who gets to go in first. To my disappointment, Mark won it, and he went in and came right out in a second or two. He was white as a sheet and wanted to go home. So curious as I go inside. This treehouse is probably 10 by 10 and about 7 or 8 high inside. The inside of the walls was completely filled with pictures of women from our locality. And not just pictures, but photos were taken in hiding. There were photos of familiar folk in poses and conditions that scarred our little minds. It seemed like some hidden cameras were set up in our homes. And the photos were clicked. Mark and I got back home as quickly as we could. We rushed home and informed my dad about it, and he called the cops. He knew that kids our age would be too naive to make this shit up. The officer shows up and asks us a few questions like where it was, how did we get up there, and where did we buy the rope. He also asked if we did manage to take any pictures off the wall. He got increasingly rude about it, and my dad put an end to the conversation. He left with our statement and said he would be in touch soon. After that, we were no longer allowed to take overnight camps in the woods or be out there for more than an hour without checking in. We were pretty much cut off from the deep exploring of the woods. About a year or two later, that same cop stopped me when I was hanging out in a different park. He saw me smoking and caught me with a joint. Mark asked him what happened with the treehouse. The cop told us to not do drugs and left us alone. Years later in college, Mark sent me an email saying how he read in the big state paper that officer shot himself with his service revolver after his wife found out he was circulating personal pictures of other women. So it comes to my mind as it came to Mark's that we had found his little stash or cave of illegally clicked pictures. The creepy part came a few months later when Mark sent me another email saying that he went to the estate auction and one of the items for sale was a rope ladder with a back. Yes, it was our rope ladder and our bag. This was the creepiest story of what I found in the woods. It still grosses me out and sends chills down my spine when I recollect my first memory of entering that room. When I was a little kid, my parents dropped me off at a local indoor pool. This pool was at the far end of our small town. The plan was to spend the entire afternoon there. However, for some reason, I ended up leaving relatively earlier than expected, and so I decided to go for a walk in the surrounding areas instead. There were no woods or anything around. It was just huge empty expanses of the classic Canadian nowhere. I ended up coming across 2 people lying in the grass. I didn't exactly come in their view as I was significantly far. I could see a large woman and a very overweight man, both in their early 20s. The man was lying on top and they were facing away from me, and my adolescent brain presumed that they must be making out. I stayed a good distance away because I was worried they'd see me, and also because the man on top was moving around quite a bit. And I wasn't really sure I wanted to see unattractive people making out, if indeed that was what they were leading up to. It did look an awful lot like the very slow makeout session to my young mind, except that as an adult, I realized that the angle wasn't right for this to occur while they both still had pants on. So I'd leave for a bit and come back every 15 minutes or so, wondering if they'd have gone or if I'd get to see something. Each time it was the same, where the overweight man was squirming around on top of this woman, her legs together and her lying still. In fact, it took a while before I realized how unnaturally still she was. She didn't move at all, hands at her sides limply while his face moved around her face and neck. I was deeply unnerved by the possibilities. I kept coming back and checking, pacing in panic circles around the walking paths in the area, and trying to come back from different angles to get a different view. But it was highly difficult because it was the open plains. No longer did my adolescent curiosity expect them to shed their clothing in an isolated field, rather I just wanted some assurance that she was okay. I never got that assurance, lost track of time, and went back to the pool, where I was screamed at and grounded for making them wait a long time. They refused to listen to anything I had to say. They didn't even believe me. But I know what I saw. and it's a strange mental picture to this day. I'm confident that this story of mine is going to sound fake, but you've got to trust me, because it surely is not. After graduating from college, my eldest brother wished to spend the weekend camping at Lake Berryessa, which is just outside Napa in California. His girlfriend at the time, Sally, said that we could use her godfather's boat, which was docked over there. So we hitched it up and headed up to the Spanish Flat dock. So to paint a picture in your head, the bank of this lake is surrounded by sandy hills and rocky cliff sides, in a bowl-shaped valley. Now let me tell you, it's not so easy to climb down in some areas, and the landscape has a lot of trees spread all over. It's a very big lake, so it's possible to not see anyone around after sunset. The people, too, will typically tie up their boats and camp out on the banks. We got in our boat and headed towards the southeast corner and found a nice spot to chill. We swam for like maybe an hour or two and then had our dinner. I think it must have been about 7:30 or 8 p.m. because I remember noticing that the sun was setting. The lake was still and beautiful. Sally suggested that we should climb up the side of the bank and find some wood for a campfire. So my brother and I climbed up the side, trying to find dry pieces of wood. We were far back into the woods, but we could still see the boat and the lights. As we were digging around, we heard a sharp, horrifying, and echoing scream. We ran to the tree line to find Sally, who was on the boat and yelling her heart out for us, crying and obviously panicked. We climbed down the side slowly, and my brother stopped and stared out onto the lake. He said that there was something floating in the water. I looked out and saw something that was slowly drifting along toward the shore. My brother slowly walked toward the boat and told Sally to come to stand over by me. Then he walked to the edge of the lake and stood there as quietly as possible. Sally ran up to me and was crying profusely. I started to walk over to my brother and he said that he thought that it was some skinned animal. He claimed that it didn't have any skin on it. I walked up and stood behind him so that I could try to get a clearer view. The water was dark, but I could see some outlines. It was floating chest down, and there was a black garbage bag covering a part of the back. It was too huge to be a dog or anything. It didn't have a head, and I couldn't see if it had front legs or not. But whatever it was in fact skinned. It drifted slowly underwater, turning as it moved with the soft current. We stood there for a few minutes without saying anything, but I'm sure that we both were just hoping for it not to be a dead human. Sally suggested that we pack up the camp and get the hell out of there, and so we did that. As we were backing out, I was driving the boat and so I didn't get a better look at the creature. But my brother looked over the edge and tried to get a better view of it. Sally covered her eyes and was still freaking out as we headed back to the dock at Spanish Flat. There was an office there for the park department or something, but surprisingly no one was there. We drove to the closest gas station and left a note and number for the attendant to give to them. I am not sure if it ever reached the concerned authorities, because we never heard anything about it after that. I still remember how dead silent our ride back home was. The fact that Sally was horrified was evidence enough that she too guessed it to be a human. My brother too hasn't brought the topic up in years, but the last time he did, he stated that he didn't want to make a guess about what it was. He got a better look at it than me, but we didn't go back to that lake for another 5 or 6 years. It still upsets me to think about it. And I am sure that my brother knows what he saw. But he keeps it to himself just to not scar me for a lifetime. Now let's hop on to story number 2. But before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. So I am a girl, and this incident happened to me almost about 13 years ago. Back then I was somewhat 17 years old. When this happened, I lived in a small town almost in the middle of nowhere where most people lived out in the country. Around 1 a.m. in the middle of the night on a Friday, I was dropping my friend off after a night of hanging out. This friend of mine lived way out in the countryside, and to get there, one had to take a lot of winding roads with nothing on either side. And it was so damn in the middle of nowhere that not many people traveled on those roads. There were a few houses there, but most of them owned a lot of land, so they were majorly spread out in distance. I always hated dropping her off at night, because driving back was always super creepy. This was probably because I have seen way too many horror movies to know what can happen out in the middle of nowhere. But on that occasion, it was my turn to drive back home alone that night. After dropping her off, I'm being super careful while driving, not only because of my irrational fear, but because of drunk drivers who won't take the curves well. I turned left on the last small street before I got to the main road, and this street had two major curves that you had to take very slowly, since they were pretty wide and almost back to back. I was coming up on the first curve, so I slowed down a bit, and that's when I saw three people dressed in all black. As far as I remember, they had black sweatshirts and black pants, and they were walking and blocking the whole lane. It was frustrating at first, because I thought they were just teenagers not thinking of the dangers of what they were doing, so I sped up my car to hurry and pass them in the other lane. But before I could do that, a car coming in the opposite direction almost hit me. As I was passing them, I looked outside my side window to get a glimpse of the dumb teenagers' faces, when I noticed that all three of them were wearing the same creepy white skull mask, and they all stared at me as I passed them. If it was somewhat close to the time of Halloween, I might have passed it off as someone getting in the spirit of Halloween with the costumes and all, but when this incident happened, it was around June. The weird thing about the situation was that it didn't seem like they were trying to run me off the road or cause me any sort of harm. They didn't even look behind them when I first pulled upon them. It just gave me the creeps. The whole situation was too weird, so I called the police and informed them about the entire series of events. They called me back pretty soon after and told me that they sent someone to the exact location where I described and said that they found nobody walking on the street or even on the side of it. What creeped me out about that is that there's nowhere the three people could have hidden, because this street had open land on both sides of it. Also, there were no side streets that they could have turned on to evade the cops. The only logical solution for them was that they had to have been picked up by somebody or knew of a good place to hide. Either way, I know what I saw were actual people and not something I made up. I have no idea to this day what those three people were up to, but I told my friend that if she wanted me to drop her off again, it needed to be before dark, because I never wanted to find out what their real intentions were. In around 2020, during the lockdown days, I used to live in an actual cabin. And that cabin was almost in the middle of nowhere on around 150 acres of land. One side of this property was a waterfront, and the other side was the beginning of deep woods. So my days were chilled out and relaxed. Most of the time when I was tired after a walk outside, I used to spend time reading books, playing video games, and doing other indoorsy stuff. Anyways, one time I was home alone since my family had gone to see my wife's family. We had some difficulties in our marriage, so they thought it would be better for adults to discuss. So I was alone in the cabin, and I was reading a book to spend some time with. That's when I heard somebody knocking on my door. I went to check who had come to bother me out here, but there was no one. I thought I imagined the knocks, so I got back in and continued reading. The very moment I got into the mental zone of reading the book, I heard another knocking on the door. I went again to see, but this time too, there was no one outside. I tried to look down for any footprints on the floor, but there were none. This continued happening, but each time I went to check, there wasn't anybody there. It finally happened like 7 times, and eventually, I noticed someone move behind a tree. I saw him because I was hiding behind the window's curtain to spot the person messing around with me. And I saw him come towards my door again. He seemed like some scared 20 to 25-year-old, but he seemed scared. By his demeanor, it did not feel like he was up to something mischievous. It was in fact the opposite. He seemed worried and paranoid. I opened the door just as he got on the porch. He was just about to run away, but he stopped as he heard my gun clock right behind him. He claimed that he had gotten lost on a hike, and he decided to knock on a random cabin's door for some help. I was convinced by his story, so I decided to give him a ride. I drove him to the nearest town, which was about 35 minutes away. He seemed very exhausted from the hiking, so he didn't speak much throughout the ride. I still don't know how he got that lost. Because my cabin plus the plot of land was between two others, and he should have come across their cabins before mine. Now I had just recently got here, so I did not know if they were friendly people or not. But anyway, he was a lost hiker, and I did my bit to help him. By the time we came across a patrolling police vehicle inside the town, he was fast asleep. I got out and walked up to the cop to narrate the entire story. The cop didn't seem impressed, or at least that's what his expressions foretold. As I finished my story, the cop calmly asked me to look in the car. To my shocking surprise, the dude was gone. He hadn't taken anything from my car, and in fact, my car's door was not even open. He had just vanished into thin air. The officer asked me to calm down as I tried to convince him that I wasn't crazy and that there was really a young hiker in my car. He took out a picture and asked me if it was him. And he was right. It was exactly him, and in that exact outfit. He said that I wasn't the first one who had encountered this individual. There have been countless complaints and reports from people where I live to have come across this spirit of a hiker who asks for help and then vanishes upon reaching a safe spot. He assured me that he has never harmed anyone. I requested him to ride back home with me, as I was shell-shocked by what I had just encountered. Now that I think about it, I hope his soul rests in peace in those woods. As a child, I lived and grew up on a farm that was pretty much in the middle of nowhere in Missouri. Most of the time, I spent my free time roaming the woods with my dog. I used to do the typical stuff that kids do. One fine year, during the middle phase of winter, I wanted to go and walk out on the frozen pond near my home. I was of course not allowed to venture there alone because of all sorts of risks associated with it. So I asked my elder sister to accompany me. After a while of convincing her to come along, my sister obliged and we took the 15-minute walk, admiring the untouched snow along the way. As we got to the frozen pond, we heard a lady scream. And by scream, I mean an actual blood-curdling scream. This woman was in serious pain or terror. It really freaked us out for a moment, but it didn't come from the direction of our house. It came from deeper in the woods where no one lived. Now, these woods were in the direction of the other side of the pond. We didn't hear it again, and so we continued on with our walk. I know it sounds dumb, but we were kids, and instead of focusing on the potential danger, we started admiring all the different tracks that different animals had left on the snow-covered frozen pond. I kept looking around and guessing the animals from the paw prints, until we noticed a set of cat paw prints. And not just any regular prints. These were absolutely huge and had sunk in the snow deeply. Not back then, but now when I think about it, the sheer depth of the prints was enough evidence to deduce that it was a big cat. Back then, I was about 8 years old and my sister was around 12 or 13. Luckily, my sister was smart enough to know that it was time to get out of there as quickly as possible. Apparently, it wasn't unheard of that mountain lions could work their way south as far as Missouri in search of food. I'm really happy that it didn't find us in its search for prey. Oh, and about the scream, I got to know about it years later. And if you haven't heard a cougar or mountain lion cry, you should look it up. It's blood-curdling. So when we heard that scream, it was probably the mountain lion's cry. And that was logically right, since it came from the deep woods ahead of the pond. Once I was in the middle of the woods, when I had come across an abandoned elementary school. It seemed like it just didn't belong there at all. I found it when I was around 12 years old, while I was exploring with my dad's hunting club, somewhere in the backwoods of Alabama. The most odd thing about it was that it didn't seem to have a road leading to it, or even a place to park cars. We looked around and there were simply no houses there. The windows and doors were dust-ridden, and it was evident that no one had entered since decades. We stepped inside the school to feed our curiosity. And the moment we got in, it felt like we had traveled in the past. Every single thing inside was from the 70s and 80s. It also seemed like it was abandoned hastily. I mean, the school's structure wasn't weakened. The books were still open on desks, shoes were still in the cubbies, and papers were still on the teachers' desks. It was as if students and teachers in an ongoing class were suddenly thrown out of this timeline or erased from existence. I actually took a lot of the books that weren't weather damaged and brought them home with me. I remember asking my dad about it a few years later, and he knew about the abandoned school in the middle of the deep woods. But he said that it always gave him the creeps, so he never went near it. My dad left that hunting club a year later, so I never had the chance to check it out a second time. But he did say that there is no documentation of this school. It just existed out of nowhere. While studying abroad, my friend wanted some help from me for doing a photo shoot. This shoot was planned to be done on a derelict building on the outskirts of the city. The building was a small rundown office building, with most of the outer walls covered in brick and all the entrances as well. Anyways, she had the idea of just wanting to walk around with the camera and explore the building. Being a camera enthusiast, I went with her to the site. Upon arriving there, I quickly noticed that on the ground, there were a lot of used needles. And not the fresh, clean ones. Instead, these were the really gross ones, with brown dried blood or rust on them. We assumed that this shady place must have been a popular shooting place among the local junkies. Then we found that on one of the brick-laden walls, an entrance had been made into the stairway of the building. Somebody had just torn a hole in the wall. In some surge of bravery, we decided to go in to get some crazy pictures. The stairway was dark because all of the windows up there were sealed shut and covered. The building had been stripped of all possible valuable materials. So it was just a gray concrete stairway. We started to make our way to the second floor when we heard a loud shuffling sound upstairs, like somebody rising up from the floor. We immediately turned around and practically jumped through the hole and ran out as fast as we can. But my friend's shoes got caught up with a nail that was sticking out of a wall. She tripped and landed on her knees as she struggled to let loose of this situation. Meanwhile, we heard someone make his way down, but it sounded like really heavy steps as it came downstairs. We could also hear some growling sounds that made us shiver. Now the next few moments were blurred, but I remember some creepy-looking humanoid creature growling or howling at us from the little gap between the stairway. It seemed like it was trapped inside. Its eyes were green, and it stood on two legs, but the height was unnaturally long. Before I could process this in my head, my friend got rid of her shoe and screamed to run out as fast as possible. So we ran and ran until we got out of the area. Almost 3 summers ago, my elder brother and I were out on some back roads in Central Oregon, trying to take some photos of the stars. We both were into astrophotography, and the sky was extremely clear that evening. So we got there, set up camp, and did the rituals. Now this place was somewhere far from the town. We chose it so that there won't be any sort of pollution or disturbance too. The night went great, and we were convinced that we had clicked a bunch of good pictures of the night sky. Trust me, it looked breathtaking. When we got home and started looking through the pictures, there was this one picture that was among the first ones that we saw. It was around a 20-second exposure in absolute darkness, and the road was clearly visible, and so were the tall coniferous trees under the sparkling stars. And just near the tree line, not so far from us, we could see this guy, who was just watching us while standing completely still. We were out there for a solid 30 to 40 minutes after we took that photo, and never even knew that the guy was there. The creepiest part was that when we were there, I had illuminated the road with a flashlight for a brief second, but I didn't even see him with the light on. Now I don't know what he was doing there. There are no other ways to come to that spot. It is just one straight road that took us to our spot and back. Nowhere did we see another car parked, or any houses too. Now that I think about it, I just hope that he was a human, and not some sort of an alien trying to study mankind. Thank you so much for listening to these stories. Now that you have made it till here, I want you to choose the topic for the next video. Comment down below and let me know your favorite topics for a horror podcast. Also, I'd love it if you could bring more horror story lovers to our Mr. Scares horror community.